My name is Stella Harper. I was 39 years old the night my family finally realized they didn't know me at all. "You're pushing 40 and still unmarried," my Aunt Carol said across the dinner table, while casually cutting into her chicken. "Maybe it's time to lower your standards a little." The room instantly went quiet. My younger sister Jenna froze with her wine glass halfway to her lips. My mother suddenly became fascinated by the potatoes on her plate. My cousin Mark looked down like he wanted to disappear into the tablecloth. I picked up my wine slowly. "I didn't lower them," I said calmly. "That's exactly why I'm happy." Jenna almost dropped her glass. Nobody expected me to answer like that. In my family, I had always been the quiet one, the one everyone pitied without openly saying it. The single daughter, the lonely older sister, the woman they imagined sitting alone every night eating microwave dinners in silence while everyone else moved forward with their lives. The funny thing was, they were completely wrong. And honestly, I planned to keep it that way forever. Not because I was ashamed, because I knew my family. Everything in our family was a competition pretending to be concern. Someone bought a house, somebody else suddenly upgraded theirs. Someone got promoted, another cousin immediately brought up a higher salary. Compliments always came attached to tiny insults, like poisoned ribbons wrapped around gifts. And relationships were the biggest competition of all. Aunt Carol treated her 35-year marriage like a Nobel Prize. She mentioned it constantly. Birthdays, funerals, random dinners, holidays. If there were oxygen in the room, Carol could somehow connect it back to her marriage. Jenna was even worse. She got married young and acted like she had beaten life itself. That was exactly why I never told them about Daniel Mercer. Daniel had been part of my life for nearly 2 years. 2 quiet, steady, peaceful years that belonged entirely to me. We met at the most boring event imaginable, a mutual friend's birthday dinner where neither of us knew anyone else. By the end of the evening, we were sitting in a corner talking about terrible action movies, awkward first dates, and the strange ways people pretend to be impressive. There were no games. No emotional chaos. No jealousy. No dramatic breakups followed by dramatic reunions. Just peace. And after a lifetime of surviving my family's emotional minefields, peace felt almost unreal. I protected our relationship the way people protect fragile things, by keeping it far away from my family. Unfortunately, Aunt Carol had always viewed my life as a tragedy she personally needed to narrate. "Poor Stella just hasn't met the right man yet," she loved saying loudly during family gatherings. Or worse, maybe Stella's just too picky. That night at dinner, Carol leaned back in her chair with a satisfied little smile. "Well," she said, crossing her arms, "if you're so happy, maybe explain what exactly that means." Mark gave an awkward laugh. "Carol, leave her alone." But she wasn't finished. "You can't say something like that and expect us to believe it," she continued. "You live alone, Stella. We all know that." 8 faces stared at me across the table. Waiting.
Judging.
Expecting another excuse. For one brief second, I considered lying again. I had done it for years because it was easier. But something about the way Carol smiled at me that night hit a nerve I didn't even realize existed anymore. So I placed my wine glass down carefully. "I'm not single." Silence. Complete silence. Jenna blinked rapidly. "What?" "I've been seeing someone," I said. "For how long?" my mother asked slowly. "Almost 2 years." Aunt Carol actually laughed. 2 years?" she repeated. "And nobody here has ever heard about him?" "No." "Why not?" I looked directly at her. because I know this family." Nobody spoke after that. For the first time in years, Carol didn't immediately have a response waiting. But Jenna leaned forward quickly. "So where is he?" she asked. "At home," I answered, probably waiting for me to finish being interrogated. Another silence. Then Carol smirked. "Well," she said, "if he's real, bring him to Thanksgiving." Every eye at the table turned toward me. I had spent nearly 2 years making sure Daniel stayed far away from situations exactly like this. But something inside me shifted that night. Maybe I was tired. Maybe I was angry. Or maybe I finally wanted them to see that my life wasn't the sad little story they kept telling themselves. So I nodded once. "Fine," I said. "You'll meet him." At the time, I honestly believed Thanksgiving would just be awkward. I had no idea it would end with shouting, accusations, and one moment that would permanently change how I saw my family. Thanksgiving was 3 weeks away. The next morning, I told Daniel what I had done while he stood in my kitchen making coffee. "I might have accidentally invited you to Thanksgiving with my family," I admitted. He looked up calmly. "Accidentally?" My aunt cornered me. He thought about that for exactly 2 seconds. "Is this the same aunt who asked if you were too demanding last Christmas?" "Yes." "And the same sister who tried setting you up with her coworker who owns medieval swords?" "The very same." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "So this will probably be entertaining." That was one of the things I loved most about him. Nothing rattled him. He approached problems the way other people approached crossword puzzles. Meanwhile, I was already anxious. "My family can get competitive," I warned him carefully. "With what?" "Everything." He leaned against the counter, holding his coffee mug. "Are they going to interrogate me?" "Yes." "Judge me?" "Definitely." "Say something rude?" "Almost guaranteed." Daniel smiled slightly. "Well, at least I know what I'm walking into." That calm confidence was exactly why I wanted to protect him from them in the first place. I didn't want their bitterness touching the peaceful little world we built together. But now the invitation existed, and my family became obsessed immediately. The group chat exploded the next morning. "So apparently Stella has a secret boyfriend." "Mark, wait, what?" "Mom, 2 years and nobody knew?" "We'll see if he actually shows up." That last message told me everything. They didn't believe Daniel existed. To them, I was still the lonely older daughter who read books, avoided dating apps, and supposedly scared men away with high standards. The idea that I had quietly built a serious relationship without telling them made them uncomfortable, which meant they were already preparing to investigate him. Over the next few weeks, Jenna became relentless. "What does he do? How old is he? Where did you meet? Why haven't we seen pictures? Why hasn't he proposed yet?" That last question came while Daniel and I were sitting on the couch watching a terrible action movie. My phone buzzed. "Just curious. If it's so serious, why hasn't he proposed already?" Daniel noticed my face immediately. "What happened?" "My sister wants to know why you haven't proposed yet." He burst out laughing. "Already?" "Apparently, 2 years is a deadline now." Daniel pretended to think seriously. "Should I bring a ring to Thanksgiving just to scare them?" I laughed, despite myself. That would literally start a war. Good to know. But beneath the jokes, something heavy kept building in my chest as Thanksgiving got closer. Not fear, exactly. More like anticipation. Because my family didn't simply meet people, they tested them. Small comments disguised as jokes. Subtle insults wrapped inside concern. Quiet little competitions nobody acknowledged openly. Most people missed it entirely. Daniel wouldn't. And deep down, I wasn't sure what would happen once he finally saw the real version of the family I spent my entire life carefully navigating. Thanksgiving arrived faster than I expected. Daniel picked me up that afternoon wearing a dark sweater and carrying a pie box. "Peace offering," he said. "For my family?" "No, for us. Emotional support pie." I laughed as we walked toward my parents' house. Cars lined the street already, voices spilled through open windows. Somewhere inside, somebody was loudly arguing about football. Daniel looked at the house carefully. "Last chance to run." "Too late now." We walked inside together. The second we stepped into the living room, every conversation stopped. 8 people turned toward us simultaneously. Aunt Carol stood first. She looked Daniel up and down, slowly, evaluating him with the same expression people use when inspecting expensive furniture. Then she smiled. "Well," she said softly, "so he is real." At that exact moment, Daniel squeezed my hand gently. And suddenly, I realized something important. My family thought they were about to examine him. What they didn't realize was that Daniel was already quietly studying every single one of them, too. The silence lasted only a few seconds, but it felt long enough for everyone to decide what role they wanted to play. My mother recovered first. "Oh, good," she said, hurrying toward us with a smile that looked more nervous than welcoming. "You made it. You must be Daniel." Daniel handed her the pie box. "I brought dessert." My mother blinked, genuinely surprised. In our family, people usually arrived empty-handed and then criticized the food already on the table. "Well," she said, taking it carefully, "that's very kind of you." Across the room, Aunt Carol was still watching him like she was waiting to find a defect. Jenna walked over next. "So," she said, folding her arms, "you're the mystery boyfriend." "Apparently," Daniel replied. She looked him over with an uncomfortable little smile. "You look normal." Daniel nodded politely. "I try not to scare people before dinner." Mark laughed from the couch. Jenna didn't. A few minutes later, we moved into the dining room. The table was crowded with food, candles, wine glasses, and the kind of forced holiday warmth that always made me tense. My mother started assigning seats, and somehow Daniel ended up beside me, directly across from Aunt Carol. I knew immediately she considered that a victory. "So, Daniel," Carol began while pouring herself wine, "Stella says you two have been together almost 2 years." "That's right." "And in 2 years, none of us have ever met you." "That's also right." Carol tilted her head. "That's unusual." Daniel glanced at me briefly. Stella mentioned family gatherings could be intense. Mark nearly choked on his drink. Jenna gave a sharp laugh. Intense is one word. Carol didn't like that answer. I saw it in the way her smile tightened. "So what do you do?" she asked. "I'm a structural engineer." "What kind of structures?" "Mostly commercial buildings and restoration projects." "Oh," Carol said, sounding unimpressed, despite clearly not knowing whether that was impressive or not. Jenna jumped in quickly. "Where did you two meet?" "At a friend's birthday dinner." "That's it?" Daniel smiled. "That's usually how meeting works." Mark laughed again. I gently touched Daniel's knee under the table, a silent warning and a silent thank you at the same time. Jenna ignored Mark. "And you've just been secretly dating my sister this whole time?" Daniel looked at me, then back at Jenna. "It wasn't secret to us." That answer landed harder than he probably intended. Because the truth was, my relationship had not been hidden from the world. Only from them. Carol leaned forward. So, where do you live? About 20 minutes from Stella. House or apartment? House. That got her attention. Oh, really? Daniel nodded. I bought it a few years ago. Jenna and Carol exchanged a quick glance. I recognized it immediately. They had moved from suspicion to comparison. Dinner continued, but the questions didn't stop. How old are you? 39. Yeah. So basically Stella's age, Jenna said. Yes. No kids? No. Never married? No. Carol sipped her wine slowly. Well, she said, that's interesting. Daniel waited a beat. Why? Carol smiled like she had been hoping he would ask. Most men your age have a past. Daniel didn't look offended. I have a past, he said. I just don't usually bring it to Thanksgiving dinner. Mark laughed so hard he had to cover his mouth. Carol did not laugh. The tension started building after that, slow and heavy, like pressure behind a locked door. Every answer Daniel gave was calm, simple, and honest. Somehow, that irritated Carol more than if he had been rude. Finally, Jenna leaned back in her chair. I'm just surprised Stella never told us about you. Daniel turned slightly toward her. You'd have to ask Stella. So, she did. Right there. Why didn't you tell us, Stell? Everyone looked at me again. I took a slow sip of wine. Because you all judge everything. No, we don't, Jenna said immediately. Daniel didn't say anything. He simply looked around the table quietly. And that was when Aunt Carol decided to escalate. Well, she said, setting down her fork, let's be honest. We were only worried Stella might scare away another good man. The room froze. My fingers tightened around my glass. Daniel slowly looked up. Another one? Carol smiled. Oh, yes. My stomach dropped. I knew exactly where she was going. She had loved telling this story for years. The problem was that the story was never true. Didn't she tell you about the last man she chased off? Carol asked. Daniel's expression stayed calm. No, he said. She didn't. Carol leaned back, pleased with herself. It was a few years ago. Stella dated a man named Eric. Nice guy, very patient. But apparently Stella was a little demanding. Jenna lowered her eyes, hiding a smile. That's one way to put it, she added. I stared at my plate. I could feel heat rising behind my eyes. Not tears exactly. Anger. Old anger. The kind you bury because arguing only makes people call you dramatic. Carol continued. Eric invited her out with his friends one night. She complained about the restaurant, criticized the music, and made everyone uncomfortable. Mark frowned. I don't remember that. Carol waved him off. You were in college. Daniel looked at me. Not accusing. Just checking. That almost made it worse, because I suddenly wanted to explain everything all at once. Then he looked back at Carol. And that's why they broke up? Oh, yes, Carol said. Eric told us Stella was impossible to please. Jenna nodded quickly. He said she scared him. That was the moment I realized they had planned this. Not formally, maybe, but emotionally. The way Jenna jumped in, the way Carol paused at the right places. They weren't remembering a story. They were performing one. Daniel didn't respond right away. He simply picked up his fork, finished the bite he had already taken, and set the fork down again. Then he asked one question. Did Eric tell you that personally? Carol blinked. Well, yes. Daniel nodded slowly. Interesting. Something about his tone made Mark stop chewing. Carol narrowed her eyes. What's interesting? Daniel folded his hands near his plate. I'm trying to understand the timeline. What timeline? You said this happened a few years ago. Yes. And Eric came directly to you to explain why he and Stella broke up. Carol lifted her chin. Yes. Daniel nodded again. So how did he know you well enough to do that? The table went silent. Carol stared at him. What do you mean? You said he invited Stella to meet his friends, Daniel replied evenly. But somehow, afterward, he was comfortable calling her aunt to explain the breakup. Nobody spoke. Daniel continued calmly. That's unusual. Most people don't report relationship updates to their girlfriend's aunt. Mark started grinning. Jenna looked confused. Carol's expression hardened. Eric was close with the family. Daniel tilted his head slightly. How close? Carol opened her mouth, then closed it. For the first time that night, I realized Daniel wasn't just defending me. He was dismantling the story. Not with anger, not with accusations. Just simple questions Carol hadn't prepared for. She tried to recover quickly. Well, she said, he came to a few family dinners. How many? She paused. 2, maybe 3. Daniel looked thoughtful. So after 2 or 3 dinners, he felt comfortable calling you personally to explain his breakup with Stella? Carol shifted in her chair. He respected my opinion. Mark muttered under his breath. Sure he did. Daniel glanced at him, then back at Carol. Did Stella know he called you? The question hung in the air. Carol hesitated again. Well, not exactly. I finally looked up. Because he didn't. Jenna rolled her eyes. Oh, come on, Stella. But Daniel spoke before the argument could begin. Carol, can I ask something else? She clearly hated the direction of the conversation, but she nodded stiffly. What? Where is Eric now? Carol frowned. How would I know? Daniel's voice stayed even. I assumed you stayed in touch since he trusted you with relationship advice. A few people laughed quietly. Carol's face flushed. That is not what happened. Daniel leaned back slightly. I see. The conversation stalled. My mother reached for the gravy boat, even though nobody had asked for it. But Jenna suddenly jumped in again. Look, she said. The point is, Stella can be difficult sometimes. I turned toward her. Difficult? You know what I mean, she said. You've always had high standards. Daniel looked at Jenna. Is that a bad thing? It depends how high. Then Jenna said something she clearly thought would help. For example, Stella once turned down a man because he still lived with roommates. Daniel nodded slowly. That seems reasonable. Jenna blinked. No, it's not. Plenty of people have roommates. Daniel looked around the table. Do any of you? Nobody answered. Because everyone at that table was either married, living alone, or very proud of owning a house. Mark laughed again. Carol slammed her fork down. You're twisting everything. Daniel stayed calm. I'm asking questions. You're trying to make us look bad. He paused, then looked at me before answering her. I don't think I'm doing that. Then what are you doing? Carol snapped. Daniel folded his hands on the table. I'm trying to understand why every story about Stella tonight makes her the problem. The silence that followed felt different. Not awkward. Exposed. Carol opened her mouth, but before she could answer, Mark spoke. Actually, he said slowly, now that I think about it, Eric didn't call you. Carol turned sharply. Mark! He shrugged. You told that story after you ran into him at the grocery store. You said he looked uncomfortable and tried to leave. Jenna stared at him. What? Mark nodded. Yeah, that's what happened. Carol's chair scraped against the floor as she shifted. That is not how it happened. But the room had already changed. People were looking at her differently now. And Daniel quietly picked up his water glass. He had not raised his voice once. Yet somehow, the story my aunt had used against me for years was falling apart in front of everyone. But Carol wasn't finished. And the next thing she said would turn the entire night into a disaster. Carol looked around the table and realized something terrifying. She was losing control of the room. For years, she had managed conversations the same way. Talk loudly, sound confident, keep moving before anyone questioned the details. Most people never challenged her because arguing with Carol was exhausting. Daniel wasn't arguing. That was the problem. He was simply making people think. And once people started thinking, the cracks became impossible to ignore. This is ridiculous, Carol snapped finally. You've been here less than an hour and somehow everyone's acting like I'm lying. Nobody answered immediately. That silence said more than words could. Jenna tried stepping in quickly. Nobody said you were lying. Mark gave a quiet laugh. You kind of were, though. Carol shot him a glare sharp enough to cut glass. You always do this, she said. You twist things. Daniel remained calm beside me. I'm not twisting anything. Yes, you are. He shook his head slightly. I asked simple questions. And you're making us sound terrible. Daniel paused. Then he said something softly that somehow hit harder than shouting. I don't think I'm making anyone sound like anything. The room went still again. I watched my mother stare down at her plate, clearly wishing she could disappear entirely. My father hadn't spoken in nearly 20 minutes. Jenna kept adjusting her napkin nervously while pretending she wasn't uncomfortable. And suddenly I realized something painful. This wasn't new. Daniel had simply noticed it faster than anyone else ever had. Jenna leaned forward again, trying to regain control. Look, she said carefully, you have to understand, Stella can be intense sometimes. I turned toward her slowly. Intense? You know what I mean. No, I said quietly. Actually, I don't. She sighed dramatically, like I was making things difficult for her. You've always expected a lot from people. Daniel looked at her. And that's bad? Nobody said bad, Jenna replied quickly. Just unrealistic. Something inside me tightened at that word. Unrealistic. I had heard it my entire life. Too independent. Too careful. Too selective. Too hard to impress. Every time I refused to settle for less than basic respect, someone in my family acted like I was sabotaging myself. Daniel rested his arms lightly on the table. What exactly are Stella's unrealistic expectations? Jenna opened her mouth immediately. She once stopped seeing a man because he forgot her birthday. Daniel blinked once. That seems fair. It was only their 3rd month dating, Jenna argued. Daniel looked genuinely confused now. So he forgot her birthday during the honeymoon phase? Mark laughed loudly into his drink. Jenna glared at him. You're missing the point. No, Daniel said calmly. I think I understand the point perfectly. Carol cut in sharply. The point is, Stella always finds reasons relationships won't work. Before I could answer, Daniel spoke again. Or maybe she notices problems early instead of ignoring them. Carol laughed coldly. That's easy to say when you're new. Daniel nodded once. That's true. Then he looked directly at her. But I've noticed something tonight. Nobody moved. Every eye turned toward him. He continued in the same calm voice. Every story about Stella somehow ends with Stella being blamed. Carol crossed her arms immediately. Because she's not perfect. I never said she was. Then what are you implying? Daniel leaned back slightly. I'm wondering why nobody here talks about Stella with kindness. The silence afterward felt suffocating. I couldn't even breathe properly for a second. Because no one had ever said that out loud before. Not once. My entire childhood flashed through my mind in strange little pieces. Carol laughing when I cried after a breakup at 19 because I was too sensitive. Jenna telling relatives I was intimidating because I preferred staying home over partying. Family dinners, where every achievement somehow turned into criticism. Even when I succeeded, it came attached to something negative. Pretty, but intimidating. Successful, but lonely. Independent, but cold. I suddenly realized I had spent years defending myself against accusations I never deserved in the first place. Carol scoffed loudly. Oh, please, we love Stella. Daniel nodded politely. I'm sure you believe that. The temperature in the room seemed to drop instantly. What's that supposed to mean? Jenna asked. Daniel looked around the table carefully before answering. I think sometimes families get comfortable assigning roles to people. Nobody spoke. He continued. One person becomes the successful one becomes the funny one becomes the difficult one. After a while, nobody questions it anymore. Mark stared at the table quietly. And that scared me more than anything else, because I could tell he knew Daniel was right. Carol's face hardened. You think you know our family after one dinner? No, Daniel answered honestly. I think I know Stella. That sentence landed directly in my chest. Because he did. More than any of them ever had. Carol laughed bitterly. You have no idea what she's like when things don't go her way. Daniel finally stood up then. Not aggressively. Not dramatically. Just slowly pushing his chair back from the table. And somehow, that movement alone silenced everyone. He looked directly at Carol. I actually know exactly what she's like. The room became completely still. Daniel's voice remained calm, steady, controlled. She's patient. I felt my throat tighten instantly. She listens before reacting. Jenna looked away first. She apologizes even when things aren't her fault. Nobody moved. And honestly, Daniel continued softly, she spends most of her time trying to avoid unnecessary drama. That last sentence hung in the air like a spotlight. Nobody could escape it. Because everyone knew exactly who created the drama in this family. Carol's expression turned furious. So now we're dramatic? Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked around the table quietly. And for the first time all night, I saw genuine disappointment in his face. Not anger. Disappointment. Like he had hoped to find something warmer here for me. Then he said the sentence that changed everything. Now I understand why Stella kept me away from all of you. Silence. Heavy. Humiliating. My mother looked devastated. My father finally spoke for the first time in nearly half an hour. That's enough, he muttered weakly. But it wasn't enough. Not anymore. Years of tension had finally cracked open. Carol stood abruptly. Oh, that's rich, she snapped. You walk in here acting superior after hearing half a conversation. Daniel stayed calm. I don't feel superior. Yes, you do. No, he replied evenly. I feel protective. That word hit me harder than I expected. Protective. Not controlling. Not possessive. Protective. Because for the first time in my life, Someone was looking at the situation clearly, instead of asking me to tolerate it quietly. Jenna suddenly pushed her chair back too. "You're both acting like we're monsters." Mark sighed heavily. "Carol started this." "Why are you taking their side?" Jenna shot back. "I'm taking the side that actually makes sense." Carol looked at me now instead of Daniel, and suddenly her voice softened in the most dangerous way possible. "This is exactly what happens with you, Stella." I frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" "You isolate yourself from people the second they disagree with you." There it was. The familiar manipulation. Not addressing the cruelty. Not acknowledging the insults. Only criticizing my reaction to them. For years, that tactic worked on me. That night, it didn't. I looked directly at her. "No," I said quietly. "I isolate myself from people who enjoy humiliating me." The room froze. Because I had never said something that honest to her face before. Carol stared at me like I had slapped her. Jenna looked genuinely shocked. Even my mother slowly lifted her eyes toward me. And suddenly, I realized something strange. I wasn't scared anymore. Not of Carol. Not of Jenna. Not of any of them. Because once someone finally validates what you've been surviving, it becomes impossible to unsee it. Daniel turned toward me gently. "Do you want to stay?" Such a simple question. But nobody in my family had ever asked me something like that before. Not what I should do. Not what would keep the peace. What I wanted. I looked around the table one last time. At Carol's anger. Jenna's defensiveness. My mother's silence. The exhaustion on Mark's face. And suddenly, all I felt was tired. Not emotional. Not dramatic. Just deeply, completely tired. "No," I said softly. And that was the moment everything finally changed. The silence after I said no felt strangely peaceful. Not awkward. Not explosive. Just final. Carol looked stunned that I had answered so quickly. Jenna stared at me like she expected me to backtrack at any second, to laugh nervously and smooth everything over the way I always used to. But I was done smoothing things over. Daniel reached calmly for our coats. "That's unbelievably dramatic," Carol snapped. Neither of us answered immediately. And somehow our silence irritated her more than fighting would have. "Oh, so now you're just leaving?" Jenna asked sharply. I looked at her. "Yes." "Over one conversation?" I almost laughed at that. One conversation. As if this night existed in isolation. As if years of little humiliations, passive-aggressive comments, comparisons, and rewritten stories had magically disappeared because they happened quietly. Daniel handed me my coat. Carol folded her arms tightly. "You know what your problem is, Stella?" Normally, that sentence would have hooked directly into me. Normally, I would have waited anxiously for whatever criticism came next, mentally preparing myself to defend who I was. This time, I just felt tired. "I think I know what my problem was," I replied calmly. She blinked. I kept confusing criticism with love. The room went completely silent. Even Jenna looked shaken by that one. My mother opened her mouth slightly, like she wanted to say something, but nothing came out. Because deep down, everyone at that table knew exactly what I meant. Carol laughed once, but it sounded forced now. "Oh, please, we're family." Daniel finally spoke again. "Family shouldn't enjoy tearing someone down." Carol pointed toward him immediately. "There, that's exactly what I mean. He's turning you against us." I looked at her quietly. "No," I said. "He's the first person who ever helped me see it clearly." That hurt her. I could tell. Not because she felt guilty, because she was losing control. People like Carol survive by controlling the narrative. As long as I remained the difficult one, she never had to examine herself. But the story wasn't working anymore. Mark suddenly stood too. "I'm gonna be honest," he muttered awkwardly. "This whole thing got weird a long time ago." Jenna turned toward him immediately. "Seriously?" "What?" he said. "Daniel's not wrong." Carol stared at him in disbelief. "You're siding against your own family?" Mark rubbed the back of his neck. "No, I'm saying maybe Stella's been treated unfairly for years." Nobody spoke after that. Because once someone says the truth out loud, pretending not to hear it becomes impossible. I looked at my mother one last time. Part of me still hoped she would say something. Anything. Tell Carol to stop.
Defend me once.
Acknowledge what was happening. But she just sat there, quietly, with tears gathering in her eyes and her hands folded tightly in her lap. That hurt more than Carol ever could. Because silence can wound people too. Daniel gently touched my arm. "We should go." I nodded. And then we walked out. Nobody stopped us. Not even Jenna. The cold air outside hit my face like waking up after a long sleep. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke while we crossed the driveway toward Daniel's car. Inside the car, everything suddenly became very quiet. No tension, no criticism, no emotional performance. Just silence. Real silence. Daniel started the engine, then looked over at me carefully. "I'm sorry that got messy." I stared out the window at my parents' house, glowing behind us. "It wasn't messy," I said softly. He waited. "It was clear." That was the first honest Thanksgiving of my life. The strange thing was, peace arrived faster than I expected afterward. At first, the family group chat exploded. Jenna sent paragraphs accusing me of embarrassing everyone. Carol claimed Daniel had manipulated the entire situation. My mother texted me separately, saying she hated conflict and wished everyone could move on peacefully, which somehow still sounded like she wanted me to apologize. I didn't answer. For the first time in my life, I stopped trying to explain myself. Weeks passed, then months. The silence became lighter instead of heavier. I stopped waking up anxious after family gatherings because there were no family gatherings anymore. I stopped rehearsing imaginary arguments in my head. I stopped feeling like I had to justify every boundary I set. 3 months later, I blocked the family group chat entirely. And honestly, peace came immediately after that. One snowy evening in December, Daniel and I were sitting on the couch eating leftover pie and watching another terrible action movie when he glanced at me carefully. "You okay?" I realized something surprising then. I was. Not pretending. Not surviving. Actually okay. "Yeah," I admitted quietly. "I think I forgot life could feel this calm." Daniel smiled softly. "You spent a long time managing other people's emotions." That sentence stayed with me because it was true. My entire life, I had been adjusting myself to make other people comfortable. Smiling when comments hurt. Staying quiet when stories were twisted. Accepting criticism disguised as concern. Even my so-called high standards were never actually high. I simply wanted honesty. Respect. Consistency. Kindness. The things my family mocked me for wanting were the exact things Daniel gave naturally. That realization changed everything. The following Thanksgiving, it was just the two of us. No crowded dining room. No competition. No interrogation disguised as conversation. Just soft music, candles, wine, and Daniel carrying another pie into the kitchen with a dramatic expression. "Emotional support dessert," he announced. I laughed harder than I expected. And suddenly, I understood something important. For years, my family treated my singleness like failure because they believed being chosen mattered more than being happy. But loneliness isn't living alone. Loneliness is sitting at a table full of people who make you feel small. That Thanksgiving with Daniel felt warmer than every holiday I spent with my family combined. Sometimes Jenna still tries contacting me. Occasionally, my mother sends quiet little messages asking if I'll come back for Christmas one year. Maybe someday I will. Maybe I won't. But if I do, it'll be because I choose to. Not because guilt dragged me there. Aunt Carol still tells people I'm stubborn. The funny part is, for the first time in my life, I don't care. Because Daniel was right. I didn't need lower standards. I needed distance from people who benefited from seeing me unhappy. And now, every Thanksgiving is quiet. Peaceful. Warm. Usually involving pie. And honestly, I've never been happier keeping my standards exactly where they are.